Good afternoon. As I think about this World Affairs Forum each year, I am always struck by what awesome, awesome students I have. I can tell you about our students, both the panelists here and our questioners in the audience that are, they're in the batter's cage waiting for the next step up, and they're going to do a great job. And I could tell you that they're all really, really nice kids, and that is a wonderful thing. I could tell you all that they contribute a great deal to our school environment, and that too is a great thing, and they're clearly quite good looking. However, what they bring to us today is their terrific curiosity, their terrific intellect, and their minds. They have thought through these subjects. Many of us, when we were in school, the trick was to think about how it was the teacher thought and what he or she wanted, and to give it back to them. They do so much more than that. What you will hear today is a very, very in-depth conversation, certainly guided by their teacher, who also, by the way, is quite wonderful, and, you know, kind of cute too. They were guided by their teacher, but they were guided by their teacher to explore new things, to think about things deeply, and to give you their view on very important topics. I admire them so much that I'm occasionally tempted to stand up like I'm at a football game and go, yes! But that would be wrong, so I won't be doing that today, although I'm quite sure they would deserve it. But I'd like you to pay attention to the intellectual curiosity, to the minds that you see in front of you today. Because the topics that they're talking about, yes, they are world issues, but they're talking about them in a way that means something to them. And I'm sure you will find it quite interesting. At this time, I'd like to introduce you to the person who is responsible for this August group, and that is Chris Dennis.
Good afternoon. I'm always humbled every year, first to be a part of this. Can you hear me? Is this all right? And also, you know, the repeat people who come to support this event, the excellent questions, the thoughtful questions, and the dignity that your presence brings to the students that are here, and the speaker that's here. We are very grateful for that. I was reminded often by my students that in the film Lincoln, there's a scene where Daniel Day-Lewis says, "I could give a speech, but I might get too lazy to stop." And my sophomores are often remembered and reminded of that. So I'll be very brief and give the show to who it deserves to. I'd like to talk just a little bit about the program that has been developed here by this year by Jack as part of his senior project, the Model United Nations Club. If you look around, many students that are here have either expressed an interest in Model UN or have participated in it. And it's amazing in such a small school to go to these conferences and not only compete, it's not really even competition, but to excel in so many different ways with kids from all over the world. And our kids are really special for that. There are many Model UN members here in attendance, and I do want to acknowledge them very briefly. But I'll start just with the panelists. Alvin this year is a senior. I'll work this way. And you know, he's a dynamic kid. He approached me about doing Model UN this year, and I said, I'm not sure, bud. There's a lot of kids who have waited a long time, who have sat their turn, but if you want to apply for a special committee and basically be an independent contractor, go for it. I totally support it. And he did, and he was accepted into a highly competitive specialized conference. He served on the Roman Senate, and he also won Best Delegate for his committee. So we'll just start this way. Bridget Snyder is a junior, and she again is a veteran at this. She applied for a special committee and also was accepted. She served at a non-governmental organization program, and I think it was Girls Not Brides, right? And I know that's inspired you as you think about your senior project next year as well. So congratulations and nice job. Wilson King is a junior, and this year we were actually afforded the opportunity to represent the country of France. which is a huge deal. You're a Power 5 country. You, in a lot of ways, broker any agreements that are made at the conference. And Wilson this year, for the second year, but expressed interest as a freshman, was part of the United Nations Economic and Social Council for Asia, and he excelled, as did all of our kids at that. So we're happy you're here as well. Lastly, Jack Roush. I remember Jack emailing me freshman year, expressing an interest in Model UN, and I remember going down, it used to be Miss Clark's room, I guess it's Miss McMillan's now, and saying something, and Jack, little, I'll say it, little pudgy freshman, says to me, did you get my email about doing Model UN? And I said, I did, and usually we don't get to take freshmen, but we'll do our best. And we had a spot, and he attended, and the rest is history. He's done an absolutely phenomenal job building the club, making it unique, and also taking on the World Affairs Forum, which could be a project in and of itself. So Jack's outstanding, and you're really going to be in for a treat today. There's a variety of Model UN students here, and I do want to acknowledge them. And boy, I don't want to miss anyone. So why don't you stand up, if you don't mind. Elizabeth Nunzig is a sophomore. She's here. She took this on at this forum as part of her senior project, as did Julia Sinatra, Isabel Eddy, Gabriela Amato, and Oscar Cespedes. So there are sort of 5 questioners in the audience. You'll hear from them, I'm sure, in the second hour. I'll just tell you real quick. Elizabeth, your committee, she represented the Special Committee on Reform of the UN at the conference. Julia and Isabel were on the legal committee, again representing France. Oscar was on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and Gabriella was on the Special Political and Decolonization Committee. So they tackled some really heavy issues and did it as sophomores fluently, expertly, and genuinely. So we're happy you're here as well. Max Krantz was here as a senior, again in a similar spot as Alvin, and Max represented the World Health Organization, which was a perfect connection in his interest in science and bringing that to the UN. Nadia Raz was here, and Nadia, as a senior, first time through, took on a really weighty committee. I know you with the International Monetary Fund, and so you're dealing with lots of dynamic economic issues, and she did an excellent job. Henry, Jack's brother, also represented the Security Council as France, which is a huge deal. Rebecca Rods, you should also stand up. Rebecca came to every single meeting as a sophomore. Throughout the 4 years, I usually tell kids if I can get you to come once, I'm really happy. And we've been able to bring some sophomores, and Rebecca came to every meeting, participated, and helped fundraise, and we're excited about her as well. Tell me I didn't miss anybody, because I need to stop talking. I'm getting lazy, and I'm not stopping. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. So I really want to turn the show over. This show, I'm embarrassed even to put my name in the program. This really has almost nothing to do with me other than to facilitate it, to secure a date, usually to secure a speaker, although Jack did that all by himself this year. So I'm going to turn it over to where the attention belongs, and that's with Ambassador Lewis, who's was a speaker, probably one of the first or second speakers. We appreciate you coming back. Your resume speaks for itself. I won't even attempt to give it justice, because I'm sure I won't, but we're so happy you're here to share your time with our students in our community. Thank you. Oh, lastly, this is like the most important thing. So if you need to use the restroom, if you go through that door, you'll see a New York Giants towel from 2011. It was against the Falcons. We beat them in the playoffs 24-2. I think we won the Super Bowl that year. You'll see the towel. The men's room, if you see the towel, go to the right. If you need to use the ladies' room, take a left, and you'll see it right by the copy machine, most importantly. When we do a question and answer, we encourage that. We hope for it. we'll just have to pass the mic around so that we like to celebrate this and remember it every year through video, and that best happens when we have the mic so that we can pick up everyone's voice. So I'll sort of awkwardly, I'm sure, facilitate that. On the program.
All right, so I'm going to go first. I have some opening remarks that were on the program. Sorry about that. Can you hear me? Okay, so as you all know, I am Jack Roush. I'm a senior from Roxbury. The first thing I'd like to do is say thank you to Ambassador Lures, not just for being here today, but for his years of service to our country as a diplomat. So thank you, and I'd like a round of applause for him, please. Secondly, I would like to thank the student panelists for being here today. These are students that are very capable, and they are students that I'm very proud to call my friends. Next, I would like to thank Mr. Dennis. He makes this event possible year after year. He is our advocate with the administration, and he is our voice. Mr. Dennis, thank you for believing in me from the time I was a pudgy freshman until now. I could not be here today without you, and this event would not be possible without you. And finally, I would like to thank my family for their love and support throughout the years. My father, Matthew Roush, who's sitting right there, and his work as an Air Force pilot has increased my international awareness from the time I was 5 years old, and he brought home this. This is a rock that's labeled Iraq. Now, he brought this home when I was 5 years old, and it really boggled my mind. When I was 5, I didn't know what Iraq was, and I certainly had no idea why my father was there and why he brought home this rock for me. But the questions that this rock raised inspired me to have global awareness even when I was a child and today. It gave me a thirst to learn more about the world around me. My mother, Lisa Roush, has long worked in the niche field of art history, a career that has spilled over into our home. The art lining our halls from all countries and time periods has inspired me to be a student of history and global culture. From the inspiration instilled by my parents, I have sought to learn more about all things international as a student. I have spent 4 years on Model UN, 3 on debate team, and I have had the opportunity to further my education beyond high school. In 2016, I attended the Republican National Convention, and thanks to a military scholarship, last year I had the privilege of attending the University of Southern California to study international relations. All of these experiences and people have impacted me greatly and will influence my education and career in the future. But no one class has influenced me more than Chapag's foreign policy class, taught by Mr. Dennis. It introduced me to the world of ideas and served as a formal environment in which students such as myself and the panelists here today could explore our interests beyond student-led extracurricular activities. This is why I was disheartened to learn that Mr. Dennis's foreign policy class has been removed from the curriculum. Though we are faced with declining enrollment, which can and will be mitigated through STEM, we must never forget classes like foreign policy. A class to contemplate and explore everything from deep-sea mining to food security to the topics discussed today will be deeply missed. I believe I speak for many when I say that we must never lose sight of classes such as these. They are called the humanities for a reason. They teach us to be human, to think, to communicate, and to understand one another in a world of 8 billion people. Foreign policy certainly was an exploration of humanity. For this reason, I urge the members of this community, the school board, and the administration to reconsider their decision to cut foreign policy or to support Mr. Dennis in his desire to add comparative politics to Chapag's curriculum. As I ready myself to turn the page to the next chapter in my life, I am honored to share what I have learned in this chapter. I am honored to do my part in increasing awareness of our global community here in the Chapag community. Thank you. And I now invite Ambassador Lures to deliver the keynote address.
It's good to be back with everybody, and if you've just questioned whether there are any leaders in the room, you just heard one. Jack is an impressive guy. We've been emailing back and forth for a couple of months, and I'm impressed only through email. I wanted to meet him. And his father's here, too. I want to thank him, too, for his role. Principal Gallo, thank you for coming. You and Christopher Dennis are two stars in the universe of making sure the next generation has an interest in the world and in their own education. You're given far too little credit in our society, and I want to say now that public service is always credited. I mean, in the military, diplomatic service, but teachers are not nearly as credited as they should be. So let's give a hand to the teachers. I'm here because it's a good school, community school, because I have 3 grandchildren here. They're way back there, somewhat hidden away, embarrassed by their grandfather, standing up there trying to make sense out of life. And I wanted to know why some of the other students came. And I thought to myself, well, maybe they came because they had so many snow days off, they were missing school, and they wanted to come back and spend some time here. Or maybe they were given some sort of award. I thought today, as I speak, my job is to speak for 30 minutes, and your job is to listen to me for 30 minutes. And if you finish your job before I finish mine, you can refer to your iPhone, please. Don't get up and walk out. I thought that we'd get to nuclear nonproliferation toward the end because I had a different, Jack and I had worked out a sort of different scenario. And I had spent most of my life dealing with Russian affairs, dealing with Cuba, dealing with Czechoslovakia under communism, and now dealing with Iran. And so I guess my major interest is in finding out how the United States deals with its enemies. How does it think about dealing with, how does a president think about dealing with those countries which are our principal adversaries? And I teach a course at Columbia. I've taught it for 10 years. I call Talking with the Enemy. And so I thought I'd give you some of the lessons I've learned through my years since I was first supposed to go with President Eisenhower to Moscow in 1959. So I've had many years working on this matter. In all, 65 years since I went in the Navy when I was 21 years old. Actually, it's more than that, isn't it? 67 that I've spent on this. So here, I'm just going to give you some of my lessons. There are 5 lessons. And I will explain how they play out in the Middle East today. You won't be surprised to learn that Washington, the President of the United States, the White House, has not listened to, heard, or understand, never mind implement any of my lessons, many of my ideas. So rest assured, I'm speaking the wind. The first is about winning. We in America believe we're winners. We are proud of our winning tradition. Our sports metaphor is everywhere. Kick the ball between the goal posts or a slam dunk. And these formulations often become transferred to the larger scale of business and then fallaciously to international affairs. There are no slam dunks in international affairs. And so I guess my point, and here I'm sure the Spartans have done very well, the coaches of the Spartans have done very well, but the games are not like world affairs, and you can't use the same way of thinking about them. There's a whistle at the end of the game, it's over, and if you lost, you can come back and win next year. there's no way that you can replay history with regard to relation between nations. So we've often thought that you win by toppling a leader. We toppled Saddam Hussein. Where did it get us? Disaster. We toppled Gaddafi. Same thing. Mubarak. Same thing. Saddam Hussein. And all of them led to other consequences, and you can't turn that chapter back. Now, I know you fought in Iraq, and you understand the role you were carrying out was to defend American interests against the Al-Qaeda and subsequently ISIS. But I guess my basic argument, my basic lesson over the years, including I've had an obsession about Vietnam, that unless you know what your objectives are, you don't know when or whether you've won. And if you haven't defined the reason you're deploying your military forces anywhere in the world, they won't know when they've won until they've achieved the objectives you've set them to achieve. And in the case of Iraq, the case of Afghanistan, never mind Syria, there's no clear understanding of what will enable the military to withdraw from this event. In the Second World War, we had to eliminate the powers of Nazi Germany and Japan. Winning meant getting rid of those governments. Winning meant take over these countries and start from scratch. And we defeated them. Total surrender was the motto of Franklin Roosevelt. Every war since then, we've tried total victory. None of them have worked, and all of them have led to some other consequences, which I think over time we're learning to regret. And that's not to say that the military that we have has not been outstanding in carrying out their mission, but their mission should have an end. And the end should be defined when they have won, when they have done their job. In the Middle East today, we don't have a clear mission in Iraq. I guess on one hand it's to get rid of the Islamic State, which we helped do. Another is to make the government of Iraq somewhat stable. In Syria, our objectives have always been confused, whether it's to get rid of Assad, to get rid of ISIS, to get rid of the rebels, whoever they may be. And in Afghanistan, where we've been for 17 years, it seems unlikely that we're going to define at this stage what winning for the military is going to be like. So define your win is the first lesson. Second lesson is know your enemy. I am very fond of a philosopher, a Chinese philosopher from the 1st century before Christ, Sun Tzu, who says, "If you know the enemy and yourself, you need not fear the results of 100 wars." Here was a military commander who understood that if you know what you want and you know what your opponent wants and you spend a lot of time thinking about that, you can very often find ways to reach solutions short of the use of military force. And that's sort of the motto that I've followed most of my life. Not that I'm against the use of military force. I was in the Navy for 5 years. I wanted to make it a career. I was even appointed to West Point, and I didn't go. But so my respect for the military is not matched by anybody in this room. On the other hand, the military are some of the most intelligent. The military officers are some of the most intelligent ones I know. in working the U.S. government. General Mattis, who's your Secretary of Defense, is I know really quite well, and I'm very close to his staff, and I admire him enormously. But I'll get to that in a minute. So Sun Tzu sort of says to us that you've got to spend a lot of time thinking about who that is your opponent is. Coaches, the best coaches in this country, are coaches that go out and scout the enemy, the opponent. The weeks before the game, the big football game or the big basketball game, the best coaches know what the weak points are and the strong points are, so that he can deploy his or she can deploy the players around the weaknesses of the other team. And it's in sports, again, it's an obvious thing. You want to know how good your opponents are in what they do, and help your kids understand that. In foreign affairs, it's even more important that you talk to, understand, learn about what is in the minds of these people you might go to war with. They all have weaknesses. We all have weaknesses. There's not one person in this room who doesn't have insecurities. And when I was a kid in high school, in your age, I got that insight for a whole variety of reasons. And I've had it ever since. And the insecurities I had were a lot. My most serious insecurity was I had skinny arms, and I was so embarrassed every time I took off a shirt that I wore my shirt most of the time. But there were lots of things that I don't really care much about. You want to see my scopes, my skinny arm? There are lots of things that I don't worry about anymore. But I do think you have to understand that when you have an enemy, whether it's in your class or a person who's mean to you, there is a way to figure out, why is that person behaving that way? Well, in international affairs, it's the major element, I think, in conducting our foreign relations, is why is Russia doing what they're doing? Why is Assad so criminal? What's going on with Iraq and Iran? Why are they all behaving? What do they want? And at some point, you decide that you're going to negotiate with this enemy, or go to war with them. And very often, we've gone to war. In Vietnam, the people who took us to Vietnam War were all Europeanists. Not one of them knew anything about Vietnam, nor in Korea, which is the war I was in. So it's paramount that the presidents, who none of them who will know anything about these countries, have the best advisors who are experienced in knowing the enemy and knowing what the enemy needs short of fighting. So then, and today in the Middle East, the president has virtually no advisors now on Korea, and very few who are competent or in senior positions about Iraq, Syria, and the broader issues, including Afghanistan. Third, there are no military solutions. That's my third message. The military take you to a point, but since total surrender is not going to happen in this model world, with nuclear weapons having spread the way they've spread, with terrorism the way it is, with other problems encroaching from around the globe, it's not likely that we're going to have a situation again where we go to war with another state and take over the state, get rid of them like we did in Germany and Japan. So what's short of total military victory? And that has to be determined by the political leadership of the country. We have to decide there are some things we'll that are not vital to us, but that are vital to them because we know them. And we're going to make a deal so that we Americans get what we need, and they get a lot of things they want. Compromise is essential in the world today. It must be done through international cooperation, through the work of the United Nations, through other international work by NGOs. But you're not going to find that deal if you don't know about the problem and know about the enemy, or the other combatants. So in the Middle East today, there are no clear military solutions. We have somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 troops deployed in that region, written broadly. Most of them not in direct combat, but some are being killed, including special forces troops. By the way, one of my best friends is a guy named Eric Olson, who was command of special forces. He was the naval commander of special forces when Osama bin Laden was taken. And he and I have talked about this a lot, and I think I'd love to have him come speak to any audience I could ever get, because he's such a star as a person. So the military today are by far the most popular institution in the United States. 75% of Americans admire our military. Most of the other institutions in the United States, both in and out of government, whether it's lawyers or accountants or diplomats or particularly members of Congress, have a popularity somewhere around 30 to 40%. None of us gets over 40%. But here the military is the most respected part of our society. And they have a large role in our society. But I guess my concern is that they should not be the maintainers of U.S. national security. That setting the goals and defining what is a win in terms of international relations should be done by a combination of military and civilian cooperation. We have a constitution which sort of says that. And as much as I admire General Mattis, I don't know McMaster and I don't know Kelly, but they're the triumvirate that is defining American national security, and they're all military. And I teach a course on the Cuban Missile Crisis, among other things, and at that table, deciding what to do with regard to whether to attack Cuba or not, there were no military officers. One occasion was Maxwell Taylor, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, but all the rest were civilians. And whether there should have been several more military, we would have been better off. But the fact is, the councils of government, including the Obama era, have been primarily military officers. Fourth, diplomats are, I think, essential to the work we have, and the people who learn diplomacy, who begin to function like diplomats, because even though they may be political, not professional, they begin to realize that unless they know what Russia is all about, unless they know what North Korea is all about, unless they know what China is all about, you're not more than all about, but what are their anxieties? What do they want? What can we do that will satisfy some of their needs and yet allow us to proceed in the way we think is essential for the United States? Diplomats in this country, as contrary to what I told you about the military, are held in low regard. We're sort of wimpy intellectuals who don't really want to win for the United States. Our instinct is to sell out, to make a deal, and we don't really seem to know much about our country. We've lived so much abroad and we've spent so much time defending the interests of other countries to our president that we're not listened to very often. Now, this isn't a self-punishing expression on my part that we haven't been, nobody pays attention to us, but it is an expression of the reality, and particularly today when the career diplomacy, career diplomats are being gutted by this government, and about 60% of the most competent members of our foreign service have left or been kicked out. You can't function without a capacity to understand what other countries are thinking and how do you negotiate with them. If President Trump should meet with the leader of North Korea, which I find difficult to imagine, but should he do that, he will not have a competent group of people who really know the history of U.S.-Korean relations, going back to the war in the 1950s, and the many negotiations and the many efforts we've had over previous governments, periods, that tried to deal with this problem of the nuclear potential for North Korea. Now they're a nuclear power. How do we deal with that? And you don't have anybody who knows how to do that. So diplomats in the Middle East are almost out of the game. The Secretary of State spends very little time on that. We obviously are strongly supportive of Israel. We've committed ourselves to Saudi Arabia, and we're out of the negotiations for the solution in Syria, and we should be in them. Finally, my priorities. As one of the lessons I've learned, the Chinese say that when there is disorder under the heavens, leaders become obsessed with small problems, while big problems are ignored. When there is order under the heavens, leaders concentrate on the big problems, and the small problems are resolved routinely. We've been concentrating on the little problems. Second is, we should concentrate in the Middle East on political and humanitarian solutions to these terrible problems. There are no military solutions. We need the military to fight for national security, and clearly that objective of weakening ISIS and the Islamic State was essential. And that's being accomplished. The third is we have to dedicate more of our time to nonproliferation and reducing nuclear weapons. There are two ways that I can see our human civilization end. One is through massive nuclear warfare, and it would have the capacity of weakening, if not eliminating, the potential over the long run of human civilization on this earth. And the other one is global warming. And frankly, the group in the U.S. government now that is most conscious of the dangers and threats to U.S. security of global warming are the military. And they're leaders within the U.S. government. And they don't listen to those who say it doesn't exist, because it does. So I guess I would say that we should devote a lot more time to the threats against American national security and civilization, the security of civilization, and less to the wars in which we're involved, where until we define what we're trying to do there, we should get out or reduce our presence. I want to conclude on one note. I'm a Russian expert, and one of my favorite stories was back in the 1950s when, after Stalin had died in Russia and Soviet Union, he died in his bed. Nobody got rid of him, and he was put in a tomb in Red Square. Maybe some of you were there. And then in the tomb, while he was in the tomb, Khrushchev, who succeeded him, decided that Stalin had been a disastrous leader, and he began to try to get people to understand how terrible Stalin had been. And he took him out of the tomb, and he didn't know what to do with the body. And so he went around the world, and he went to Kennedy in the early 60s and said, look, at President Kennedy, we have a body I'd like to get rid of. Let me fly it low over the Grand Canyon, and we'll drop it in the Grand Canyon. And Arthur Schlesinger said to him, no way. The New York Times will find out the next day. You'll never get away with it. So he went around the world, and everybody turned him down. He went to Golda Meir, and he went to Golda, who was then Prime Minister of Israel, and said to her, look, I've got a deal for you, Golda. We will fly over the Dead Sea very low, and we'll drop Stalin in the Dead Sea, and nobody will ever know. And in return for that, we will improve your relations with the Arab countries. We'll be your defenders in the Arab countries, and we'll recognize you as a state. And we'll send our ambassador there, and everything will change. So she went to the cabinet, and she talked with them, and they all thought it was sort of an interesting idea. And so she called him back. She said, Nikita, let me be clear what the deal is. You recognize us as a state, and you defend us with the Arabs, and we will in turn accept Stalin's body in the Dead Sea. And he said, that's the deal. And she said, but the cabinet says I should warn you that Israel has the highest resurrection rate in history. Okay. So that's, these leaders, these terrible leaders will come back. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Lures, for the keynote address. I will now be talking about broken promises with denuclearization. In 1991, Ukraine and Kazakhstan came under control of the world's third and fourth largest nuclear stockpiles. For a time, these countries held more nuclear firepower than Great Britain, France, and China combined. The collapse of the USSR, an entire pole of global power, had thrust these fledgling nations, along with Belarus, onto the world stage as newly minted nuclear states. It was unclear whether Ukraine, Kazakhstan, or Belarus had the capability to operate their inherited stockpiles, but that did not make the threats to international security any less real. If it was unclear whether these states could use them, it was just as unclear whether these states could adequately secure them. Threats of an environmental catastrophe from missile silos on the Kazakh steppe, black market weapons sales, or political turmoil leading to the rise of a rogue nuclear state made clear to the former Cold Warriors on both sides of the Atlantic that something had to be done. In 1992, Kazakhstan and Belarus quietly met with envoys from the United States and Russia in what is now called the Lisbon Protocol, with the express purpose of giving up their weapons. It was decided rather quickly that Kazakhstan and Belarus would ratify the Non-Proliferation and Strategic Arms and Reduction treaties. The Russian Federation would collect and destroy the weapons accordingly, while the U.S. would send advisors to oversee the dismantling and destruction of missile silos and highly enriched uranium. In return for their cooperation, Secretary of State James Baker offered normalized political and economic relations with Kazakhstan and Belarus. In addition, Baker offered $35 million worth of food aid to be sold at market price in order to jumpstart the new liberal market economies of these countries. This had the dual benefit of encouraging them to continue with the liberalization process. The Lisbon Protocol showed the world that compromise is possible in denuclearization. It also showed the United States that a carrot is sometimes better than a stick, as carrots in this instance had served them well. Ukraine was a slightly different story. Russia had attempted to handle the situation bilaterally, but in 1993, the US was brought to the negotiating table. Ukraine's concern with giving up their nuclear arsenal was, of course, Russia. Memories of oppression and the Holodomor remained on the minds of the Ukrainian politicians and people. However, the US promised financial compensation and a security guarantee, codified through the Trilateral Statement and the Budapest Memorandum. The Budapest Memorandum also guaranteed open economic relations with Belarus and Kazakhstan, and this was ratified by all parties, including Russia, in 1994. Fittingly, sunflowers were planted in Ukraine on former nuclear sites to show that in the new system of globalization and liberalization, swords could be turned into plowshares. This is a picture of former Secretary of Defense William Perry with the defense ministers of Russia and Ukraine. And this is actually the event where they planted sunflowers. You can see in the corner that sunflowers are being planted to signify the ratification of the Trilateral Statement. So the precedent for using the carrot to incentivize denuclearization had been set, with what I call the sunflower system becoming an international model. After failing previously, the US lifted sanctions partially on North Korea in 2000, after international inspectors had found no progress on their nuclear program in accordance with a 1999 agreement. For a brief moment, there was hope that rogue states could be stopped not with war, but with carrots. Then things changed. In April of 2003, Saddam Hussein was deposed. Muammar Gaddafi watched this and wished to normalize relations with the West, still isolated after the Pan Am Flight 103 incident over Lockerbie, Scotland. So, he decided to follow in the footsteps of the former Soviet states. In December of 2003, Libya shipped its illegally obtained nuclear material to the US for disposal and opened their doors to inspectors. The long-running Libyan nuclear program was dead. According to the Brookings Institute, this development was lauded by the international community, with officials on the US National Security Council saying it would come with, quote, explicit quid pro quo. Yet, relations between Libya and the US did not normalize. 7 years later, Gaddafi himself said he had hoped Libya would be an example to other countries, but we have not been rewarded by the world. Of course, in 2011, the US supported the Libyan opposition in the Arab Spring and went on to expedite and facilitate the deposition of the Gaddafi regime. The quid pro quo discussed in 2003 did not come to fruition, and disarmament was only a stepping stone to Gaddafi's demise. This broken promise was a canary in the coal mine for other leaders, like Kim Jong-il and the Ayatollah Khamenei, and other leaders such as Bashar al-Assad. While the US promised carrots, it could not be trusted in the eyes of autocrats. Like North Korea and Iran, Libya had threatened to create and use nuclear weapons on other countries, notably Switzerland. Like North Korea and Iran, Libya had violated disarmament deals in the past. The parallels were strong enough to scare other potential nuclear powers out of cooperation. The situation with Libya could be attributed to a misunderstanding. Or it could be said that the humanitarian crisis within the country outweighed any of Gaddafi's expectations during his commitment to disarm Libya. As such, it is important to note that the US has not only broken its denuclearization promises to Libya, but has also broken its denuclearization promises to every single other country except Pakistan. The sunflower system has failed. In 2011, the US was continuing the disarmament process in Belarus. That year, despite what was agreed to in the Budapest Memorandum, and the nation remaining a post-socialist dictatorship, the Obama administration imposed economic sanctions on Belarus. This blatant breach of its promise for economic openness and normalized relations led to the Lukashenko regime ending its final push for disarmament, allowing Europe's last dictatorship to maintain control of over 100 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. This highly enriched uranium could end up on the black market or in future nuclear weapons. The US sacrificed total denuclearization of this country for the sake of economic sanctions that have failed in democratizing Belarus. The nation that has been most affected by broken promises is Ukraine, which had lost its invasion insurance. While Russia did not uphold its side of the deal in maintaining Ukrainian security, we obviously have not upheld ours. Despite the fact that we had numerous chances to, the US did not facilitate Ukrainian accession into NATO or the European Union. We removed missile defense systems from Poland and the Czech Republic, and we did not come to the aid of the Ukrainian people as Crimea, Sebastopol, Luhansk, and Donetsk came under Russian control. If our partners can't trust us, how can our enemies? Adding insult to injury, while Ukraine has faced partial Russian invasion, we have continued to benefit economically from Ukrainian denuclearization. According to Sam Nunn, former chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, 10% of American electrical power comes from plants powered by uranium recycled from Ukraine's former nuclear stockpile. In this, we are delivering propaganda victories directly to our enemies. You had better believe that Kim Jong-un and the Ayatollah Khamenei know that our light bulbs are burning in part because eastern Ukraine burns. You can switch. I have a map of Ukraine. This is just a map to show the situation in Ukraine. You can see that large swaths of the country, especially Russian-speaking areas, are seeing revolts, and they could potentially see Russian invasion in the future. Luhansk and Donetsk in the corner are currently under de facto Russian control due to pro-Russian separatist groups taking control, and Crimea, of course, has been totally invaded and occupied by Russia. So obviously we have failed our commitments to Ukraine, because not only has Ukrainian territory fallen under Russian control, but these security threats continue to prevent Ukrainian accession into NATO or the European Union. And so in effect, they prevent Ukraine from turning into a modern Western state. It also prevents Ukraine from carrying out liberal reforms necessary to protect and help the Ukrainian people. We have failed Ukraine. It is easy for us to play Monday morning quarterback with foreign policy. And in some instances of broken promises, whether it is Libya or Belarus, it could be said that humanitarian benefits have been worth the cost. However, there are clear lessons to be learned from American efforts to denuclearize states in the past that we must use as we move forward with North Korea, Iran, and the rogue states of tomorrow. Firstly, if we are committed to denuclearization as the foremost issue when dealing with these states, it is imperative to keep our promises, whether they be to use a carrot or a stick. This is especially true when dealing with states that have similar interests to our own, like Ukraine. Secondly, we must stand up to states fomenting broken promises, like Russia. Our word is only worth as much as the strength we are willing to put behind it. Finally, we must remember that while states like North Korea and Iran are rogue, they are rational. They make decisions accordingly. While North Korea and Iran have their own strings of broken promises, they will be and are far less willing to cooperate with us if we fail to assert ourselves and keep our promises. Every action and inaction taken before the international community is watched and scrutinized by both friends and enemies alike. The world stage is just that, a stage. It is not yet a field of sunflowers. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Okay, my name is Wilson King, and today I will be speaking on how a need for diplomatic credibility has promoted nuclear proliferation in rogue states. Over the past 200 years of global interactions have been characterized by a Western dominance in technological and militaristic advancement. Since the end of World War II, the United States has followed this trend of involvement and adopted a policy of global policing meant to limit the spread of communism and authoritarianism in weak states. However, this policy of intervention and alienation has not come without consequence. In a world dominated by British, Russian, and American interests, Weaker states have relied upon nuclear proliferation to establish their diplomatic credibility and promote nationalism over hegemony. From South Africa to North Korea, nuclear weapons have allowed for isolated states to guarantee they're being taken seriously on the global stage, protecting the integrity of their governments. In the instance of South Africa, nuclear proliferation was a preemptive measure taken to protect the sovereignty of the nation in a region where decolonization had created a vacuum for Soviet influence. For example, in nearby Angola, an end to Portuguese imperialism resulted in political fragmentation and civil war dominated by the Marxist movement for the liberation of Angola and the deployment of Cuban troops to the area in 1975. With tensions escalating and a Western policy of alienation imposed on South Africa because of apartheid, nuclear weapons streamlined a way for the weak country to establish itself as a regional power. As former President F.W. de Klerk would later say, nuclear weapons were not meant to be used in war against Soviet influence. They were merely a way for the nation to attract Western attention to the neo-imperialist tendencies of the USSR and its allies that had come to dominate the independence movements of the surrounding nations. In the case of South Africa, nuclear weapons were deemed an unsustainable solution to the problems of diplomatic credibility in a Eurocentric world. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the removal of Cuba's nearly 500,000 soldiers from Angola, the age of Soviet control had fallen. In a post-apartheid South Africa, President F.W. de Klerk determined nuclear weapons contradicted the nation's goals to open itself to the international community. The nationalist fervor that had supported the nation's defensive measures had ceased, and the era of territorial insecurity no longer posed the need for an atomic program. Israel has, since the end of World War II, held one of the most tentative geographical positions in the world. Surrounded by states with starkly different ideological systems, Israel needed a nuclear program to make the world see it as a legitimate actor on the global stage. Beginning with the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, the Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, would argue nuclear weapons were necessary as a form of invasion insurance against its enemies. This stance would be strengthened further after the Six-Day War, in which Egyptian militarization along the Israeli border would prompt the fledgling nation to show off its militaristic prowess. Over the course of one generation, Israel would move from a status as a political weakling to a dominating force in the Middle East and abroad, aided step by its nuclear weaponization. The issue of international aggression prompting nuclear proliferation falls much closer to home in the instances of China and North Korea. Through years of Western intervention in the Asian Pacific, the United States has created an antagonism towards the West that has characterized nuclear weapons development since. Beginning with the Opium Wars, the West has had a history of unwanted involvement in the political and economic structures of China, a pattern that has only been promoted by American rhetoric against authoritarian and communist governance. By supporting the reactionary efforts of Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang in the Chinese Civil War and First Strait Crisis, the United States would create an environment where China needed to prove to the world that it had legitimacy as a global superpower. Going nuclear was the only option. Mao Zedong, chairman of the CCP, would argue that Chinese nuclear proliferation was necessary to uphold the diplomatic credibility of the newly formed Chinese nation and take advantage of the growing nationalism that had brought the nation to revolution. Mao would write of his nuclear goals, "On the debris of a dead imperialism, the victorious people would create with extreme rapidity a civilization thousands of times higher than the capitalist system and a truly beautiful future for themselves." Considering his A-bombs a key goal for the success of the Great Leap Forward, Mao would promote nuclear proliferation as a sort of Chinese Monroe Doctrine. Rather than nuclearize to prepare for world war with the West, General Secretaries Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao would argue that nuclear weapons were necessary to end decades of American dominance in Chinese territorial domains. As in the cases of South Africa and Israel, nuclearization was a necessary step towards establishing Chinese diplomatic credibility without embracing Western democracy and liberalization. If Britain was the empire of the 19th century and America that of the 20th, China will emerge as the leader of the 21st century, aided in its expulsion of Western influence by its nuclear proliferation. But when posed with the question of how to deal with nuclear proliferation in our modern world, what has our history taught us? Can we continue to antagonize so-called rogue states and simultaneously demand they denuclearize? Although his actions cannot be considered benevolent, Kim Jong-un's efforts in the past decade to build up the North Korean nuclear arsenal have been justified in his need to establish the diplomatic legitimacy of his regime. As the United States continues to maintain a military presence on the Korean Peninsula and in the South China Sea, it continues to promote nuclear proliferation by challenging the diplomatic credibility of the authoritarian regimes that have arisen since the First World War. Perhaps in the wake of a united Korea marching under a single flag at the recent Winter Olympic Games, it is not surprising that Kim Jong-un has offered to meet with President Trump and Moon Jae-in regarding denuclearization on the peninsula. We must not treat North Korea, Iran, and others as completely irrational actors, obsessed with the size of their nuclear button. To create a global environment where denuclearization can occur, the United States must stop acting as a policeman for the world. The greatest prevention for nuclear war is not economic sanctions and antagonistic rhetoric, but a genuine respect for the territorial sovereignty and diplomatic credibility of all nations. Cooperation, not hostility, creates peace. Thank you.
My name is Bridget Snyder, and I'll be talking about resource wars today and general scarcity. If I can move to the next slide. Water is a driving force of all nature. Although quoted by Leonardo da Vinci in the 1400s, our basic need for this diminishing resource has not changed, nor has humanity's inclination to destroy one another. Today's world is plagued by threats of climate change and overall insecurity. Leaders are ill at ease knowing technology such as nuclear weaponry is in the hands of more and more actors. Nuclear warfare sparks such fear in people that diplomacy can often overlook the geopolitical angle. The United Nations has predicted the next world war will be over water, and the foundation of this is seen in Iran and Kashmir. These countries are propagators of poor water management, but also a growing nuclear arsenal. In a modern world, water wars will be fought with nuclear warfare. By attempting to denuclearize without regards to the geopolitical status and, as the title of my speech indicates, resource availability of the region, international treaties hold no water. And as time passes, the two examples listed above, despite numerous international agreements and efforts, are both subject to water shortages and mass fear. Now, in addition to addressing climate change to fix long-term water scarcity everywhere, the international community has to make treaties that adequately share resources evenly between countries with supervision. India and Pakistan have been engaged in a nuclear arms race since India ran its first testing in 1974. Tensions have always ran high between the two countries since inception, and the following three wars over Kashmir: the Indo-Pakistani Wars of 1947-1965 and the Kargil War. The Kargil War was a war attracted international spotlight as tensions boiled between the two nuclear powers. Luckily, with U.S. intervention, the countries agreed to a ceasefire. However, the people of Kashmir were the true victims of this war. Despite this, India and Pakistan continue to develop nuclear weapons just to compete with the other. Pakistan's nuclear arsenal is growing at a rate that will make it the fourth largest in a decade, behind only the U.S., Russia, and China. Currently, the country has an estimated 130 nuclear warheads to India's 110. With this in mind, the international community must, if it is truly interested in denuclearization, revisit the Indus Water Treaty of 1960 brokered by the World Bank. Consequently, the Indus River Treaty was signed by both countries in September 1960, giving exclusive rights over the three western rivers of the Indus River, Jhelum, Chenab, and Indus, to Pakistan, and over the three eastern rivers, pardon my pronunciation, Sutlej, Ravi, and Beas, to India, Al Jazeera. As you can see from the map above, India has control of the upper stream leading into Pakistan. Pakistan is completely reliant on the Indus River, the only major river system in a country where over half the population is employed in agriculture. India is rumored to have previously taken advantage of this by making dams that cut off water flow to Pakistan, such as during the famine in 1951. Now, India's portion of water flows to the Punjab region, which is considered to be the breadbasket and critical to the support to support the growing population of the country. To summarize, both countries are entrenched in a hatred towards one another, but have one critical piece in common. There is an incentive to protect their supply of water and, by extension, their economy. International organizations such as the World Bank, which has successfully brokered agreements between the countries, must revise the Indus Water Treaty to avoid abuse and most eminently nuclear warfare between the two. Iran's water sources are stretched thin as the population has doubled in the past decade and climate change eats the remaining rivers. Iran's desire to become self-sufficient in agriculture has forced them to overuse their resources and now struggle to import enough food for their people. Many countries, including our own, have predicted Iran to collapse in on itself, literally. The groundwater loss is causing the land in Iran to sink. Iran is on the top of international lists for water scarcity. And according to the New York Times, 12 of the country's 31 provinces will entirely exhaust their aquifers within the next 50 years. Water could be the catalyst that breaks the Middle East and exacerbates the refugee crisis, with an estimated 50 million residents fleeing from Iran over the next several decades. A 2015 study by two scientists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology predicted that, at current rates of warming, many major cities in the region could exceed a tipping point for human survival. Now, there's a major concern about a challenged Iran in the context of its history with the U.S. and Israel creating its own nuclear stockpile. Iran's had nuclear aspirations in the 1980s, resulting in the Iran nuclear deal brokered by the Obama administration in 2015. However, the agreement comes with some major red flags. All provisions end in 15 years, and with a predicted water crisis in Iran, the international community will far too soon face dehydrated, angry Iran with the ability to once again build a nuclear weapon. Without the demonstration of political will to enforce punitive measures and recent actions by Iran relative to their nuclear program, the present situation shows a snapshot of a country only slowing their nuclear development as water scarcity rages within its borders. Iran is expecting a 25% decrease in surface water runoff, and with another treaty that does not address resource scarcity nor accurately predicts economic growth within the country, the U.S. will have to face this problem yet again with no bargaining chips left on the table. Diplomacy not addressing the water crisis will worsen relations, and most worrisome of all, lead to further unrest in Iran. Water technology and agricultural innovation are the 21st century keys to stopping nuclear war within these areas. The World Bank and the UN should use science as a new diplomacy tool rather than great proclamations of nuclear abolishment, because they are nearly impossible to conduct and monitor, as Jack had previously elaborated on. The international community feeds the beast by signing treaties missing the context of resource availability. Luckily, better strategies for crop production exist, such as desalination, digging deep wells, and most interestingly, drip irrigation, otherwise known as micro-irrigation. Instead of flooding a field of crops to water them, micro-irrigation drips water only on the root of the plant. The company Netafim has reported a 25 to 75% reduction of water waste compared to flooding techniques and a 15% higher yield of crop. With all the countries listed above, agriculture plays a huge role in provoking tensions. Solutions for this field today are being improved, but international agreements have failed to attain the same innovative spirit. Both examples have international agreements, and yet all actors involved intend on building their nuclear arsenal. Netafim and other such agriculture innovators are the new diplomacy. Sharing resources and technology will enable security in countries who are currently inept at managing their own resources. Revolutions and wars, dating back to the French Revolution, have a correlation with famine or drought. Scarcity leads to unrest, which leaves humanity with more blood on its hands. By separating water and nuclear weapons as different problems, leaders overlook the human tendency for unrest to avalanche down the mountain of stability and into the flooded field of devastation. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Alvin Hermans, and I'll be talking about the ideological shift in American politics when talking about nuclear weapons. So, in 1961, before the General Assembly of the United Nations, President John F. Kennedy stated that every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us. This is a clear statement. It says that, in no uncertain terms, nuclear weapons are dangerous and will inevitably lead to our destruction. Contrast that with the more recent presidential address, made in January of this year. Today, I am waiving the application of certain nuclear sanctions, but only in order to secure our European allies' agreement to fix the terrible flaws of the Iran deal. This statement is less clear-cut. Nuclear, it seems to say, is permissible and even beneficial so long as it remains in the hands of the good guys. Nor is this a partisan issue. President Barack Obama, in a 2011 speech in Prague, said that, in a strange turn of history, the threat of global nuclear war has gone down, but the risk of a nuclear attack has gone up. More nations have acquired these weapons. Testing has continued. Black market trade in nuclear secrets and nuclear materials abound. The technology to build a bomb has spread. Terrorists are determined to buy, build, or steal one. Again, a responsible state, such as the U.S., in possession of nuclear weapons remains largely unquestioned. It's rogue actors, terrorist groups, and countries such as Iran and North Korea that can and should be blamed for the precarious position in which we find ourselves. So, clearly, there has been a shift in the U.S. government's thoughts about this issue. But when did this radical change begin, and why? Could you move it to the next slide? Thank you. The answer to this question, as with many others in modern American politics, lies in the second Bush administration and the beginning of the U.S. war on terror. In statements such as the following, given in 2003, "The danger is clear. Using chemical, biological, or one day nuclear weapons obtained with the help of Iraq, the terrorists could fulfill their stated ambitions and kill thousands or hundreds of thousands of innocent people in our country or any other. The United States and other nations did nothing to deserve or invite this threat, but we will do everything to defeat it." In the post-9/11 world, the American public, and therefore the president, was ready and willing at a moment's notice to point fingers, and the blame fell on Iraq, a rogue state led by Saddam Hussein. After the declaration of the Iraq War, George W. Bush's Gallup ratings jumped to above 70%, compared to his first-term average of 62%. Initial public approval of the Iraq invasion was positive, but not overwhelmingly so, around 55%. But after the president's address cited Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, that approval jumped to 67%, a 12% increase because of a rogue state's action, or at that time, around 30 million people. So if you look at this chart here, this is Bush's approval ratings over time. That first big spike is 9/11, which is understandable. But if you look right after 2003, the beginning of the Iraq invasion, there's another pretty sharp spike, which was the beginning of the Iraq invasion. And it was, you can kind of see a spike right when it was announced as well. So, this was a huge transition from the Cold War mindset, where mutually assured destruction meant that even though the world was armed to the teeth, no one wanted a war. As denuclearization isn't a partisan issue now, it wasn't then. Even Ronald Reagan, the poster child for the modern Republican Party, called for a 1/3 reduction in nuclear warheads in front of the UN General Assembly. That same president also proposed canceling the U.S. deployment of the Pershing II missile in return for Soviet cancellation of the SS-20, SS-4, and SS-5 missiles. In contrast, today's United States is working actively on modernization efforts in all three legs of the nuclear triad: massive military projects requiring billions of taxpayer dollars. So while it is true that the size of our nuclear arsenal has been decreased in recent years following agreements such as New START, which limits both US and Russia deployed warheads to 1,550, our weapons cache continues to modernize and grow in destructive capability. There has been a massive shift in the way that the United States talks about nuclear weapons. Whereas in past time, a sitting president was more likely to talk about weapons of mass destruction as an inherent evil all by themselves, a danger not worth its risks. Today, a US president is more liable to say that, yeah, nuclear weapons are a risk, but in the hands of these people, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Iraqis, you name it. The US, however, is responsible with our weapons and only uses them as a defensive measure. The logic has worked its way into the political zeitgeist, and as a result, almost all discussion about the inherent nature of nuclear weapons has vanished. We now talk about weapons of mass destruction in connection with another power, rather than as a power all their own. This line of thought is directly tied to the course of American politics, and functions now as a holdover from the Bush-era war on terror. As efforts to disarm this world continue, as we as a nation work with nations such as North Korea to peaceably end their nuclear programs, we must look inward at what it means to be a nuclear power in 2018. And maybe then we can change the definition of what it is to be a nuclear power. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lures and student panelists. Very impressive. At this time, we have about 40 minutes or so. We'd like to turn it over to some discussion between the panelists, Ambassador Lures, and the audience as well. If you have things that you'd like to ask, we'd love to hear from you, and I know our students and Ambassador Lures would love to respond. So, if you don't mind, I will pass the mic around, as we talked about before, but if there's anything you guys want to start with, perhaps.
Yes, so impressive. I don't know. You don't hear that kind of stuff in Washington, I'll tell you. One thing, given my 15 years involvement with Iran, is that I want to make clear that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon, has never had one. So they're nothing like North Korea. They had a nuclear enrichment program which had the potential for being a nuclear weapons program. But the negotiation, the diplomatic effort to stop that program was very successful, and really most of us who deal with non-proliferation believe it's a model for future agreements with other countries. Whether or not, as you suggested, in 10 or 12 years, as the agreement faces down, the Iranians decide they want to start again to build a nuclear weapon, or start at all, because we don't think they were ever on that track. We'll deal with that later. But the fact is, we've set the stage whereby Iran cannot get a nuclear weapon. It's inspected by the international community. There's no country in this world that believes Iran is on that track. So I just have to distinguish a lot between the sort of rogue Ayatollah and the leader of North Korea. And North Korea has a nuclear weapons capacity. They have probably 15 or 20 nuclear weapons. The delivery system is still in doubt, but they will get that capacity to deliver these weapons. And they have to be dealt with as a nuclear power. And that's a very different state of the world. So I felt that was important for all of you to make that clear. Okay? That's my view. Not clear from it may be false, fake facts, but it's my interpretation of all these years dealing with Iran. Good.
If I could maybe further explain the point I was trying to make, I think it was clear that I was arguing scarcity leads to unrest. And by concern with the Iran nuclear deal, if it ends in 15 years and they're going to be running out of water, and there's possible refugee crisis, we're dealing with a country who has expressed explicitly they have ambitions to have a nuclear weapon arsenal at their disposal. We need to be very careful in the future, and for sure we're going to have to deal with this sometime down the road again.
Yeah, okay.
One thing I was thinking about during the other panelists and their presentations was something that Ambassador Wallace said during my first World Affairs Forum. Now, Ambassador Wallace was an ambassador to the United Nations under the Bush administration, and so he had a really unique position on international security, which was the topic of that discussion. Now, he pointed out to the other panelists and myself that our generation appears to be a lot more isolationist than his generation. Of course, I'm sure that would be apparent to him coming from the Bush administration, but I was just curious as to what the other panelists thought about that. Is that still the case? Is that distinction still there? After today's presentations, do we seem to be more isolationist than his generation and that whole political movement? Thank you.
You four, you mean? Or the
Oh,
generation?
yeah. Basically, during the Bush administration, his generation, which I guess would be my parents' generation,
Yeah.
he was essentially saying that that generation as a whole was far less isolationist, more interventionist than our generation.
Well, that's not, isolationist and interventionist.
No, I'm saying,
is two
no.
different things.
His generation is less isolationist than ours. His generation is the interventionist generation. Ours is more isolationist. So my question that I was trying to get at is, to the other panelists, is that still the case 2 years later with the speeches that were made today?
I think that to some extent, what Ambassador Wallace said 2 years ago is even more pertinent today in the way in which the political cards have fallen in the past few years. With the election of the Trump administration, you can kind of see how the American public generally is moving from a perspective of dealing with global cooperation and opening up to international trade to wanting to be more isolationist, which is almost inherently contradictory to this idea that we should try and promote America as a global power.
I think I'd like to clarify, like, is this Generation Z that we're talking about, or the millennial generation?
Yeah, that's what I'm
I
trying
mean,
to clear.
like-
What you meant.
Where do you draw the line between Z and the millennials?
Anyone in college now is a millennial.
How about we do it this way? In your personal
opinion,
opinions, are the four of us, the student panelists, the Chappaqua student body, do we still have the same mentality with isolationism versus interventionism that we had 2 years ago?
I'll speak. I think Ambassador Luber said it pretty well that I think some young people especially have learned their lesson. You said we've been in Afghanistan for 17 years. I think all the panelists here are 17, 18 years old. That's our entire lifetime. And I don't see a lot of young people advocating for more intervention because that's all they know and they've seen the consequences of that.
You know, let me ask the question of juxtaposing isolationism to interventionism as if they're two equal and opposite. I mean, I'm neither one. My life shows that. I don't believe in U.S. intervention, and I certainly am not an isolationist. I believe in global engagement with the United States to help further peace and stability in the world. That should be our goal, and it's not necessarily interventionist. Intervention for me implies the use of military force to further our objectives. And Wallace is a classic neoconservative. I know him, and he believes, as that group did during the Bush administration, not only that military force should be deployed at a time when the United States is in such a strong power position as we were in the early part of the century, but that we can pursue Wilsonianism in the sense of making the world safe for democracy through military force. And so for him, the opposite of isolationism was interventionism, because he believed in intervention as a means of furthering our global objectives of democracy. And that's a fundamental difference I've had for a long time with Ambassador Wallace.
Are there any questions from the audience? Anything you're thinking about? I know the kids are delegates, I'm Model UN mode. Our student panelists are very interested and excited to share what they've have studied. So any questions, certainly we could turn it to the audience.
A few weeks ago, my teacher, Mr. Dennis, in the American Studies class that I take, made a point that historians have a theory that throughout the course of American history, America has gone through a cycle of switching between isolationism and interventionism. So is the point that you're trying to make, Ambassador Lewis, is to try to, instead of America switching between the two extremes of these ideas and maintaining more of a middle ground position where it's not the policing, as one of you mentioned, is more toned down and it's just sort of equal involvement but not total withdrawal from the international community? Thank you.
Good question, well phrased. Let me go back. U.S. interventionism really began with the Second World War. We were not interventionists. We very reluctantly went into the First World War, and the whole 30s, during which I was living, we were regretting the involvement we had in that war. And Roosevelt found it very difficult to get us into the Second World War. And we became an active participant. The Soviets really won that war for us, but and lost most of the lives. But the fact is that war was won, and we were left in the field of play as the only country with any power and any influence, and we were highly respected for what we'd done. So during the period of between the Second World War and the war in Iraq, the 9/11 rather, during that period we were interventionists. We believed that the U.S. forces, U.S. political economic power should be deployed around the world wherever we could to keep a balanced international world order. The UN was initially part of that idea, the idea that you wouldn't have any more wars because everybody would have to get along with each other. And we would make sure that happened. Bam, the Korean War comes. Then the terrible Vietnam War. And then a lot of the interventionist efforts of the CIA to overthrow governments. And so we became an active interventionist throughout the 50s, the 60s, 70s, 80s, and after the Vietnam War, there was about a decade where we didn't intervene much anymore. And then, and by the way, America before the First World War was isolationist. We didn't want anything to do with that world out there, except for Teddy Roosevelt had it for a while. But I think, so now what you have is a return to a situation that I think, frankly, President Trump has signaled that we, at least ideologically, that we're a country that should mind our own business at a certain level, militarily. And I hope he sticks to that. But the objective of our country, I think, now, in this new world, and this president has created a new world for the United States, is to look at the world not as either isolation or intervention, but as engagement. We should talk to all countries. We should have relations with all countries. We should work through international organizations. We should try to get back on the track of respecting international law. We have to worry about the big issues, massive migration, global climate change, and nuclear weapons. So maybe that interventionism for me does not mean the antipode to isolationism. Intervention to me is a form of international involvement which we were in for the period from the Second World War until 9/11, and it's continued up until today. And I would argue that we should go back to where we were before the Second World War and engage the world, but not necessarily militarily.
Thank you.
I just have a question for the ambassador. My father was a career diplomat, so he did impress upon me at a very young age that his job and your job had to do with all fights start with arguments. So his business was arguing before you went out and started with fists.
I speaking with failed arguments.
Yeah, right. Fights end up with, from failed arguments. So what you said earlier is something I'd also, we're all terrified by this. I can imagine all the things we've been talking about. But one of the most terrifying is that you were talking about the decimation of the State Department's career diplomats. And in light of what we've been talking about, what do you see as the potential for those being restored either soon or in future administrations that might think differently about the need for diplomacy? And that being a bad situation for which there should be hope, I hope, and you can tell us about that. On the other hand, if we've had this ingrained history of interventionism, is it a good thing that these career diplomats might be swapped out, or is the problem that there's no one to swap them out with?
The suggestion is that the career diplomats were partially responsible for the intervention of at least one proposition.
And that was just only, that struck me just as the conversation continued. That struck me only as the conversation continued. I think my main point is, if the State Department is so decimated, how are we going to have, if we want to approach a cooperative environment that is neither isolationist nor interventionist, how are we going to approach that if our arguers are decimated? And do you see any hope for them being replenished in the future?
I don't know. Very good question. I think that now I have so many friends who've left or who have been isolated. And most of the senior ranks are being depleted daily. And part of it because the White House has no interest in the professional diplomat's point of view, which, by the way, is not just President Trump. It's been going back for a long time. They think we're too, we talk down to them because we seem to know more about the world than they do, and the presidents don't like to have that heard, particularly since most presidents come to office with knowing nothing about the world, really nothing. And so how do you begin to think about dealing with the world unless you have somebody who at least you can turn to advise? Let me tell one story. Henry Kissinger I worked for for 3 years. I was deputy in his staff, and this was at the time of the 1973 war, and he became Secretary of State just before that war, and he knew nothing about the Middle East, and he knew it. He knew Germany, he knew nuclear weapons, he knew something about the Soviet Union, he'd been to China, he'd begun to learn something about China, but he didn't know the Middle East. So what did he do? I mean, he was probably the most intellectually capable secretary or person I've ever worked for, and even though I have some disagreements with him, he found that the 9 best Arabists that we had, he pulled them together, and he would travel with them. And every conversation he would have with either Sadat or King Faisal or Golda Meir or Assad or the Russians, he would talk through, tell me what I'm supposed to hear. What are they expecting from me? And he learned intensely. They never left him because he wanted to pick up every bit of subtlety that they had. And he sent a guy to Syria as new ambassador when I was there, who was a remarkable young man. And within about a month, he had sent Henry, who was on the verge of going to see the old man Assad. This was in 1974. He wrote 3 cables on how Assad is different from Sadat, how Syria is different from Saudi Arabia and from Egypt and from Israel. And the first cable was about the marketplace. He says, you deal with Assad differently than you deal with Sadat for the following reasons. And he described how the bazaar functions. How do you bargain in the bazaar? And the whole cable reflected the profound knowledge he had of the fact that, yes, Arabs are different, and you deal with them differently, and they have a different view. And it's used, my metaphor for me is, one, Henry turned to us as his major source of information because he needed to know, and secondly, he continued to depend on the career diplomats like no other Secretary of State has. Tillerson is just the opposite. I don't think he wants to listen to what we have to say. For some reason, it's a very, he doesn't include us in the package when negotiations are begun. So whether or not a new president at some point will decide that there's a reason to restore this, you will have lost a huge amount of professional knowledge, and you don't start from scratch. So this has been an 80-year growth in professionalism in my service, and it's being decimated.
Thank you.
Very new. You want me to tell you a joke?
Was there a question over here before? I'm sorry.
This question is for Bridget. I understand that you all were asked to juxtapose whatever topic you're talking about within the whole general theme of nuclear proliferation. But obviously, not only in looking at Iran and Pakistan and India, you probably have dived deeper into the whole question of climate change and global warming and the future predictions. And one of the things that I'd like to know is, did you look at what's happening in China? Because as Jack said, China will be the great power of the 21st century. And one of the common grounds that we have with China is precisely on renewables and trying to change the global situation on climate change. So can you expand for us beyond the nuclear part what you've learned in about this? And secondly, when you talk about your generation, do you see your generation as becoming ever more involved in dealing with the results of climate change, both diplomatically, economically, through business, through startups, through technology, etc.?
So if I'll first address the Chinese point, I didn't look at it for this project, but I have just on my own time. And I think it still applies to this, that quote that I used, water is the driving force of all nature. I think the Chinese government officials saw the depletion of their water, the air pollution that their cities are plagued by, and I think that is what sparked them to become involved with the Paris Climate Accords in addition to the economic benefits. And I think there really is something to be said about our generation pushing government officials, maybe not so much with this administration, but supporting climate change initiatives, because we see these, like the Syrian war was plagued by drought, by famine, and you see that becoming worse. And I think with the most recent, a hurricane in Texas and then in Florida, I hope that my generation sees these and wants to take action. At least amongst my friend group, I do see them willing to take action, seeing the change in not only this, but the scientific backing, the very real scientific backing, I believe, behind climate change. And it's is a small thing, but we see global trends of vegetarianism, of renewable energy. It's becoming higher, it's becoming more relevant and more used throughout the world. So, small steps, but I do think that our generation will make some larger leaps.
Nice. Prima.
Other questions? Nice job, Bridget. Elizabeth?
So a
common theme that I had heard through like the panelist statements, like especially Wilson, Jack, Ambassador Lewis, had been respect for these rogue nations and what they are thinking, their belief system, especially on a global scale. So what steps or changes do you think need to be implemented so that our country as a whole deals with these nations as capable, rational nations and addresses their issues as well as gives them the platform and respect that they need in the global stage?
So good. Such a great question.
I think I kind of reflected on this a little bit in my speech, but America throughout its history has kind of held this position towards these rogue nations that you've been talking about and had almost a patronizing tone in how they deal with their diplomacy. I was reflecting on a little bit how, you know, the United States continues to maintain military presence in the South China Sea and in the Korean Peninsula. And you can kind of see how this almost is a little bit hypocritical considering our history and how we enforce this idea of the Monroe Doctrine and not wanting other nations to be in our business because we knew how to do it well. So acknowledging that, I think that the United States going forward needs to treat China specifically as a power that we don't need to hold the hand of, essentially, in how they deal with their problems. And almost you can apply the same thing to North Korea. Even though they are, you know, considered to be a rogue state, Kim Jong-un is not crazy, and he understands that he needs to maintain his power. And because of that, I think that we need to ensure that we keep diplomatic relations with these countries and ensure that we don't continue to have this patronizing tone in how we deal with our diplomacy.
I agree with that completely. People confuse diplomacy and state relations with friendship. One of my favorite expressions is you keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. You all probably heard that saying. We should have diplomatic relations with everybody. We should do the business of interstate relations with everybody. We can't find out what they're up to, what they want, what their problems are, unless we're talking to them, unless we're there. So I guess the rogue state thing for me is a little bit difficult to compute as to what it means. But in the case of Iran, it's ludicrous that the most powerful country in the Middle East, aside from Israel, we don't have any dealings with. It's also sad that we don't deal with Syria, have some contact with Syria. When Kissinger was in the Middle East, he was the only Secretary of State, only foreign minister who could talk to all the governments in the region. And he did it in part because he wanted to keep the Russians out. Today, the only government in the region that talks to everybody is Russia. They have replaced the United States fully in terms of their diplomatic and political access to that region. So I guess I agree basically with your point, and I think you made it quite well in your talk, that we should have relations with countries. I guess the one question is, should we have relationship with terrorist groups? Should we have relationship with Taliban? Should we have relationship with Hezbollah? I mean, these are the new era in terms of how we deal with national security and global security. But deal with your enemy. My course is talking to the enemy. That's what I call the course. Presidents make that decision. It's fundamentally a presidential decision. Over and over again. You look back to when Franklin Roosevelt decided we should talk to the Soviet Union in 1933, we didn't have any relationship with them. We didn't know what they were up to. We had reports, but we had no relationship whatsoever. And he decided that's ridiculous. Here's Japan on the rise and Germany on the rise. We've got to have the Soviet Union on our side, or at least knowledgeable about what we're up to. And it turned out that in the Second World War, the Soviets took the brunt of the Nazi invasion of Europe, and lost 20 times more lives than we did in that war. So diplomacy doesn't mean friendship. Diplomacy means business, the business of international state relations.
If I might pose a question just to the panel and even to the audience as well. I'm a pragmatics guy, sometimes almost too much, maybe it gets in the way, but I like practical. And I love the ideal and at times idealistic nature of the conversation today, but I wonder on a practical level how much our political system, as much as I love it, handicaps politicians from having those sometimes difficult conversations with more rogue nations. You know, I think in some ways the Iran deal for even in the Republican primary became a rallying cry, and maybe some would argue impetus for ripping up that deal. I wonder how much, and really for anybody, how much our political system handicaps presidents from having those difficult conversations with countries that might end up being political suicide in a 30-second campaign ad. And that's really for anybody.
Well, oh, sorry. Okay. Well, this is kind of something we saw during the 90s. It's kind of parallel with the war on crime, right? So a president simultaneously kind of needs to think about how to best do their job in the moment and also how best to brand themselves for their campaign going forward. So it became very unpopular in the 90s to argue for prison reform, I think in the same way that today it's become unpopular to appear soft on North Korea or soft on Iran. So that's where kind of the Rocket Man statements and so on have come into play.
I agree with that completely. The Iran deal was a purely and simply domestic political issue. And I visited the Senate. I must have met 50 senators in those years of before and after the negotiations. And I go there almost weekly. And the Republicans will not have a discussion with me on this subject, except for Rand Paul and a few others. They don't want to talk about this because they see it as part of their political base. And even the Democrats who understand the value of the agreement are worried about being too public on their stature in this, and they'd like that not to be an issue locally. You're absolutely right but foreign policy becomes not only sort of irrational, becomes very domestic political question, and it's true our dealing with the Soviet Union. But if a leader of a country, if the United States had a presidential leader who somehow could convince people of the value of U.S. relations with difficult problems, I think he could go a long way toward ameliorating this domestic divide politically. Or don't go there, just don't get involved. And the United States might have to face up to the fact that over the coming years, we will, in our non-isolationist and non-intervention stature, have to choose of where we're going to be politically engaged because of the pressure of domestic politics. That's a practical and good comment. Thank you.
I think with, like you were saying, with a 30-second campaign ad, we've lost the ability to look at a treaty such as an Iran nuclear deal and look at the positives, the negatives, and how can we make it better? Could we revisit it? Should it stay in place? Like you were saying, I mean, it's disgraceful. They won't even speak to you about it. Whether you disagree with it or not, and as I did come out against it, but I came against it for in terms of resources. That doesn't address that. However, I don't think any politician at least should be against the idea of having diplomatic relations with the country and engaging in a conversation with the country, especially one that poses a threat to national security.
One thing I'd like to say is I feel as though sometimes it's hard for the American electorate and thereby politicians to give respect to these countries. I mean, you look at Kim Jong-un, he's cartoonish. He's this plump dictator who wears pants that are... I was reading an article about this morning. He wears these massive pants. Anyway.
What his hair?
His hair is crazy too. Anyway, the point I'm getting at is it's hard, I think, for the American people to respect countries when they threaten to decimate us and our allies almost incessantly. And with regards to North Korea, when we've tried to talk to them in the past, they've just broken their promises almost immediately. I think the U.S. electorate is more intelligent than we think. And I think that we can look on the past and see that stuff like this is happening. And I mean, it's always in the news whenever North Korea threatens us or our allies, or even Iran back when they would threaten to decimate Israel. So I think that it's hard for us to respect these countries if they cannot give us the opportunity to respect them.
Yeah, well, I have a question. Hello. I couldn't let today go by without asking Jack a question and put him on a spot. But first off, Ambassador, I love your idea of some sort of, not necessarily middle ground, but of engagement in the world. Having been in the uniform now for almost 32 years, if you count the Air Force Academy, I've really only known those 4 years of the Academy without being in combat. Interestingly enough, 32 years, we've only actually been at war with a uniformed enemy for about 6 months. The rest of the time has been spent to non-signatories of the Geneva Convention, which is a whole nother, hour-long conversation or a day-long conversation. But my question for Jack, not to put you on the spot, Jack, but when I grew up, and I'm pretty much everybody in the room, the players that had nuclear weapons had so many, and they were so overwhelming that we were rational actors. That there was no way that we could use nuclear weapons without the other using nuclear weapons, and it was mutual assured destruction. We all understand what that meant. Your assertion that North Korea is 100% a rational actor, I'm not so sure. We just found out last week that he's been supplying chemical weapons to Syria, which is not a rational act. He starves his own people every day. He tortures and destroys the lives of even members of his own family. So your assertion that we're dealing certainly with a rational actor may not be as sure as it used to be under mutual assured destruction. And the idea that he is going to act rationally, I think, is still a subject of debate. Why are you so sure he is a rational actor?
Thank
Hey,
you.
Dad.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks for the question.
Now, I'm not going to argue with you about Kim Jong-un and how he treats his people. It's obviously horrific. Not going to defend that. Also, with regards to his shipping weapons to Syria, North Korea has very long been involved in the black market weapons deals, including Syria, I'm fairly certain. They've been sending weapons to other countries, chemical weapons and that sort of thing, since the late 80s. So that's nothing new. And like Wilson said, it's them trying to assert themselves and have a place on the world stage. If they can supply Assad, then perhaps Russia will be more willing to talk to them and that sort of thing. But I think that Kim Jong-un is rational because if you look at other leaders like Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, when they've sought nuclear weapons or almost gotten them and other weapons of mass destruction, they have been deposed. When Muammar Gaddafi turned over his nuclear weapons, or his attempts at making nuclear weapons, he was deposed only 7 years later. And then if we look at Saddam Hussein, he was promised that he wouldn't be deposed if he didn't make nuclear weapons. He passed UN inspections. George Bush knew he passed UN inspections, but still claimed he had WMDs, and he was deposed. So the U.S. has broken its promises to other autocrats. Now, I'm not saying that he's rational with his domestic policy, but I think that Kim Jong-un looks to other actors in the past and knows that if he has a nuclear weapon, he can gain legitimacy, as Wilson said, and also use it as invasion insurance, the invasion insurance that Ukraine didn't have, as I specified, and Muammar Gaddafi didn't have. So I think that maybe not with domestic policy, but with foreign policy, he knows what he's doing. And I think that he likes where he is, and he keeps playing chicken with us the way he is. I don't think he's going to meet with Donald Trump, but he knows what he's doing. He wants to remain a buffer state between the West and China and keep running his little fiefdom. And nuclear weapons will allow him to do that. and allow him to keep teasing the West. Thank you.
May I approve of what your son said? Would you support every word? But two things. Kim Jong-un is like most leaders of a country that are autocratic. Their major objective is to stay in power. And as long as you recognize that he wants to stay himself in power and his heirs for a century ahead, we'll have Kims running that country. And he doesn't want that to go away. Now that's the core of mutual destruction. And I don't think there's any leader around who doesn't have that in mind. The issue of terrorist groups getting nuclear power, that's a totally different game because they want to die in the process. Kim doesn't want to die. And the other thing I'd have to say about Korea, during the 90s when they got the framework agreement with North Korea, when Clinton wrote the framework agreement, because of domestic politics, we didn't keep the agreement. I mean, it said they walked away from it. They didn't walk away from it. At least we don't know whether they would have had we done what we were supposed to do. But during the latter part of the 90s, we didn't supply them with the fuel, with the food, with the money that we said we would supply. And when G.W. Bush came in, he got rid of the agreement. So it's never clear in my mind why that failed completely. You certainly don't want to say it was only our fault, but we were players in that failure of that agreement. So you have to look back at that and understand what the role they're playing now in trying to build their nuclear weapon, so that there's no chance in the future we'll be able to overthrow that government as long as they have nuclear weapons.
Well, it's 4 o'clock, believe it or not. I feel like this could go to the end of the day, but before we end, if there's anything the panelists would like to just, excuse me, end with, I feel like that was maybe the fastest 2 hours of at least my weekend, month, year. But if there's anything you guys would like to end with, and then we have a little gift for you too, I'd like to explain.
I guess this kind of came up when you guys were discussing legitimizing these countries. And I guess my question is, do these leaders, does Kim Jong deserve to be legitimized? And where do we value humanitarianism in these kinds of situations? I know it said we have to legitimize the Chinese government, but again, do we consider the human rights abuses when we go to the table with them? How do we make up for that if we want to denuclearize, which is of course an admirable goal, but how do we deal with those human rights abuses if we're not to remain hypocritical?
Absolutely. Let me just have one comment.
Sure.
Thanks to you, congratulations. All of them give you a lot of credit for making this possible. And I think you, Christopher, have been a force for a lot of good for a lot of kids in the school. And the panel, I mean, I think it's time for the generation to pass. I don't, and we'll jump a couple, by the way, because I think you four have shown a knowledge of and a critical thinking about it the way I guess I wouldn't have anticipated. And I congratulate you and all the work you've done, Christopher.
Thank you. Kids are great. So if I could just make a few remarks. First of all, what a robust crowd. To have 60, I think I counted 64. I think I counted that number 5 times too, just to make sure I was right. That's incredible, and it brings dignity to the work that happens. And your presence here means more than it thinks. We also have a past panelist here. I meant to say this before. Matt Marchese is here, and it just stand up, Matt. Okay, don't stand up. But Matt was a panelist for many years and a Model UN member, and the community produces young people who love ideas and who love to think. So we're very blessed in that way. I'd like everyone to know that as a gift from the school, from the humanities department, each panelist will be receiving 2 books. We're voracious readers. We understand the world better because we read. We watch too, and we do lots of different things, but reading is really, really important. So we have a book for the panelists, The Lemon Tree. I feel inadequate to make suggestions about learning about the history of the Middle East and the company that I'm in, but I've always felt like, maybe up until today, everything you need to know about the Middle, at least in Israel and Palestine, and the relationship that's shared, can be learned from this book. It does an excellent job explaining the history behind the Israelis and Palestinians and the friendly history that existed for quite some time. It tells the history through a story. So each one of you will be receiving this copy. Also, a book that I just enjoy it. I enjoy him. People might disagree with me on that, and I welcome that. It's great. It comes from Fareed Zakaria. This is the second a version of his post 9/11 world, the United States in a post 9/11 world. So our panelists will be receiving both those books as well. If I could just for a minute too talk about, on the idea of the significance of reading is, as seen through our attendance today, we are one community. We're 3, 4, 5 towns. We're one community. We share one school. And next year we're going to try to have one school read from grade 6 through 12. And while this book is written at a middle school level, it's called Refugee by Alan Gratz. It provides an access point for every single kid to dive into these very complex issues. And, our panelists can read this, and then they can read The Lemon Tree, and then we have countless other books all the way up to college level that they can dive into as well. But this provides an access point for every kid to dive into these issues. And the author has also agreed, I think, to come speak to the entire school late September. So I think that's a blessing, and I just want to sort of put a plug in for this book, which will continue these maybe not about nuclear non-proliferation or proliferation, but about issues that shape the world that we live in today. Quickly, it's a book, A Refugee from the German concentration camp, his story, from Cuba, a young girl in 1992, and then from Syria, a young boy in 2015. So it does, I think, an excellent job tying the history that we study really well, I hope, in our classes, and sharing it as a story. These 3 different stories in totally different time periods, at least relative to the last century, ties that together. So we'll be doing this school read, and we're excited about it, and we're excited for our panelists, even though 2 of them are leaving us, but our young members that you see in the audience as well, sort of taking the lead on embracing this idea. So, Jack, you did an amazing job. Mr. and Mrs. Rausch, thanks for sharing him with us.